The Persian Gulf has always been a pressure point, a narrow corridor of water through which billions of dollars in oil flow every single day, keeping economies alive and military alliances intact. But something happened recently that military analysts are calling one of the most consequential maritime moves the United States has executed in years. The United States Navy just delivered what experts are describing as a devastating blow to Iran's strategic position, and the numbers behind it are staggering: $3.2 billion. That is the estimated value of what Tehran just lost access to, not through a missile strike, not through a ground invasion, but through a calculated, methodical, and utterly relentless campaign of naval pressure that left Iran stranded, isolated, and economically bleeding in waters it once considered its own backyard. Some analysts believe this is only the beginning. There are growing concerns that what the world just witnessed is not a one-time operation, but the opening move in a much larger strategic game, one that could redraw the balance of power across the entire Middle East. It raises an important question. Has the United States just found the perfect weapon against Iran? Not bombs, not boots on the ground, but the quiet, suffocating grip of naval dominance over the seas that Iran depends on to survive. To understand why this matters so profoundly, it is essential to understand what Iran's economic lifeline actually looks like. The Islamic Republic of Iran has spent decades constructing what analysts describe as a shadow economy, a network of tankers, intermediary companies, falsified shipping documents, and cooperative ports scattered across the globe. Through this network, Iran has managed to export oil worth hundreds of billions of dollars, despite crushing international sanctions. The system worked because no single actor controlled enough of the global maritime space to shut it down entirely. Tankers could vanish into the Indian Ocean, change their names, turn off their transponders, and reappear weeks later on the other side of the world, their cargo quietly offloaded into refineries that asked no questions. Tehran perfected this art of maritime invisibility over decades of practice. What the United States Navy just demonstrated is that this era of invisibility may be coming to a definitive end. According to multiple sources tracking the situation closely, United States naval forces have been executing a coordinated interdiction strategy targeting Iranian oil shipments with a level of precision that previous operations simply did not achieve. The key difference this time, analysts suggest, is intelligence. Satellite surveillance, signals interception, financial tracking, and human intelligence have apparently converged into a targeting picture so comprehensive that Iranian tanker captains and their handlers are increasingly unable to find safe passage. What happens next may reshape the entire region, because an Iran that cannot export oil is an Iran that cannot fund Hezbollah, cannot sustain the Houthi campaign in Yemen, cannot finance the militias spread across Iraq and Syria, and cannot maintain the patronage networks that keep its internal power structure from fracturing. The $3.2 billion figure represents what American officials and independent analysts estimate as the combined value of Iranian oil shipments that have been interdicted, seized, redirected, or effectively blocked from reaching their intended markets during the recent operational period. This is not a figure that Tehran can absorb quietly. Iran's national budget is critically dependent on oil revenue, and when that revenue suddenly disappears, the consequences ripple immediately through every government ministry, every military branch, and every proxy organization that depends on the Islamic Republic for funding and direction. Reports suggest that the pressure is already being felt at multiple levels within the Iranian system, with some sources indicating significant internal debate about how to respond without triggering an even more overwhelming naval escalation. There are growing concerns among regional analysts that the economic pressure is creating exactly the kind of internal stress fractures that Washington has long sought to engineer without resorting to direct military confrontation. The logic of the strategy is not difficult to follow. If you can bankrupt a regime, you do not necessarily need to bomb it. Every dollar of oil revenue that fails to reach Tehran is a dollar that cannot be converted into weapons, influence operations, or the kind of cash payments that buy loyalty from restless generals and underpaid intelligence operatives. Some analysts believe the United States has effectively discovered that Iran's greatest vulnerability is not its air defenses or its missile arsenals, but its finances, and that naval power is the most efficient instrument for attacking those finances. But the strategic picture is considerably more complex than a simple accounting exercise. The move by the United States Navy has sent shockwaves not just through Tehran, but through the entire network of nations and actors that have built relationships around Iranian oil. China, which has been the primary buyer of sanctioned Iranian crude, is watching this development with intense concern. Beijing has invested enormous political capital in its energy relationship with Tehran, and any disruption to that supply chain creates problems that extend far beyond the petroleum market. Some analysts believe the United States is deliberately using this naval campaign to send China a message that American maritime dominance remains absolute and that any nation choosing to defy Washington's sanctions regime does so at considerable risk. It raises an important question about how Beijing will respond, whether it will quietly accept the disruption, attempt to find new routing solutions, or escalate its own support for Iranian countermeasures in ways that could dramatically complicate the situation. The Strait of Hormuz, through which approximately 20% of the world's traded oil passes every single day, has always been the theoretical choke point in any Iran scenario. Tehran has repeatedly threatened to close the strait as a retaliatory measure in times of crisis, a threat that the international community has historically taken with considerable seriousness. But there are growing concerns that this threat may be considerably less credible than it once appeared. A United States Navy that has already demonstrated the ability to interdict Iranian shipping across vast stretches of ocean is also a Navy that would respond to any Hormuz closure with overwhelming and immediate force. Tehran knows this calculus better than anyone. The threat to close Hormuz is valuable precisely as long as it remains a threat. The moment Iran attempts to execute it, the response would likely end the capacity to make such threats permanently. According to early reports from sources within the regional security community, the Iranian military and the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps naval force have been engaged in intensive internal discussions about how to respond to the interdiction campaign without triggering a direct confrontation that Iran cannot win. Some analysts believe Tehran is genuinely uncertain about its options for the first time in years. The conventional playbook, harassment of shipping, seizure of commercial vessels, drone attacks on Gulf infrastructure, risks escalation to a level that the current Iranian leadership may not be prepared to manage. There is speculation that internal divisions within the Revolutionary Guards between those who favor aggressive retaliation and those who counsel strategic patience are becoming more pronounced as the economic pressure mounts. What happens next could determine the future of the region in ways that extend far beyond the immediate naval standoff. The Houthi movement in Yemen, which has been conducting attacks on Red Sea shipping for months as part of its declared solidarity campaign with Palestinian forces in Gaza, has depended heavily on Iranian weapons, intelligence support, and financial backing. If that Iranian support line begins to degrade because Tehran is running short of hard currency, the operational capacity of the Houthi campaign becomes significantly more constrained. Some analysts believe this is one of the deliberate secondary objectives of the naval pressure campaign, that by attacking Iran's finances, Washington is simultaneously working to reduce the sustainability of the Houthi threat to global shipping without needing to engage in the kind of large-scale ground operation that would be required to eliminate the movement militarily. Reports suggest that Houthi weapons stocks have been a growing concern for military planners and that cutting the Iranian supply pipeline is seen as a more elegant solution than attempting to interdict individual weapons shipments one by one. The situation in Lebanon presents a parallel calculus. Hezbollah has been the primary instrument of Iranian power projection in the Levant for 4 decades, and its operational capacity is directly tied to the financial support it receives from Tehran. There are growing concerns within Israeli military and intelligence circles that a prolonged campaign of economic pressure on Iran could force Hezbollah into a particularly dangerous position. an organization that knows its funding is being cut and may feel pressure to take dramatic action before its capabilities degrade further. Some analysts believe this creates a window of heightened risk, where the very success of the financial pressure campaign paradoxically increases the short-term danger of military escalation. The logic is uncomfortable, but not unfamiliar in strategic analysis. A cornered adversary with diminishing options can be more dangerous, not less, than one that still believes it has time on its side. The broader regional context adds additional layers of complexity to an already intricate situation. Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, the two Gulf powers that have the most to lose from any Iranian disruption of regional stability, are watching the American naval campaign with a mixture of quiet satisfaction and genuine anxiety. Satisfaction, because both governments have long advocated for a more aggressive American posture toward Iranian power projection. Anxiety, because both capitals understand that any Iranian decision to retaliate could put their own infrastructure in the crosshairs. The massive oil processing facilities at Abqaiq and Khurais in Saudi Arabia remain among the most attractive and vulnerable targets for Iranian missiles and drones, and neither Riyadh nor Abu Dhabi has any desire to see those facilities become part of the escalation calculus. Some analysts believe the Gulf monarchies are quietly lobbying Washington to maintain maximum pressure on Iranian finances, while simultaneously providing Tehran with enough diplomatic off-ramps to avoid a decision to escalate. There are three possible scenarios that regional analysts are currently considering as they attempt to project what happens in the coming weeks and months. The first scenario is one of sustained pressure and gradual Iranian accommodation. In this version of events, the economic pain inflicted by the naval interdiction campaign eventually forces Tehran to negotiate seriously on a range of issues, from its nuclear program to its support for regional proxy forces. This is the scenario that Washington clearly prefers, and it reflects the historical observation that economic pressure, when applied consistently and comprehensively enough, can eventually change the strategic calculus of even ideologically committed adversaries. The success of this scenario depends on whether the Iranian leadership is capable of making pragmatic decisions despite the domestic political costs of appearing to capitulate under pressure, and whether China and Russia are willing to allow the financial isolation of Iran to reach the threshold required to force genuine strategic accommodation. The second scenario involves a limited Iranian military response designed to demonstrate resolve without triggering full-scale confrontation. In this version, Tehran authorizes an attack on American naval assets or on Gulf infrastructure that is serious enough to send a political message, but calibrated to remain below the threshold that would compel a devastating American military response. This is the most dangerous scenario precisely because calibration errors in either direction carry catastrophic consequences. If Iran miscalculates and the attack is more damaging than intended, Washington may feel compelled to respond at a scale that escalates beyond anyone's control. If the attack is too limited, it fails to deter further American pressure and simply invites an intensified campaign. Some analysts believe Iran has historically been sophisticated in its ability to execute this kind of calibrated deterrent signaling, but there are growing concerns that the current level of economic stress may be distorting the decision-making calculations within the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps in ways that increase the risk of miscalculation. The third scenario is arguably the most consequential for long-term regional stability, an Iranian decision to accelerate its nuclear program as the ultimate deterrent. There are growing concerns among non-proliferation analysts that the combination of economic pressure and military vulnerability is pushing Iran toward a conclusion that the only reliable guarantee of regime survival is the possession of a nuclear deterrent that makes the cost of regime change unacceptably high. This calculation is not irrational from Tehran's perspective. The fates of Saddam Hussein's Iraq and Muammar Gaddafi's Libya, both of which abandoned or never completed nuclear programs before being overthrown with American participation, are not lost on Iranian strategists. Reports suggest that Iran's uranium enrichment program has continued to advance despite international pressure, and some analysts believe the country now possesses sufficient enriched material to produce a nuclear device within a matter of weeks if the political decision were made. What remains unanswered is perhaps the most fundamental question of all. Is the United States prepared to follow through on the implicit threat that underlies its naval pressure campaign? The strategy of financial strangulation only works as long as the adversary being strangled believes that the alternative to accommodation is something worse than accommodation. If Tehran concludes that Washington lacks the political will to escalate beyond economic and naval pressure, the entire strategy collapses into a test of endurance that Iran, with its demonstrated capacity for absorbing hardship, may ultimately be able to outlast. The $3.2 billion blow was devastating by any measure. But in a strategic competition where the stakes are measured not just in dollars, but in the survival of governments and the balance of nuclear deterrence across an entire region, the question is whether devastating is sufficient. The naval campaign has already achieved something that years of diplomatic pressure and intermittent sanctions enforcement could not. It has made Iran's leadership genuinely uncertain about its ability to sustain the economic foundation of its regional strategy. According to multiple sources, the mood within the upper echelons of the Iranian government is one of genuine alarm rather than the performative defiance that Tehran's public communications typically project. There are growing concerns within the regime that the combination of naval interdiction, tightening financial sanctions, and the visible degradation of Iranian-backed proxy forces in multiple theaters is creating a convergence of pressures that exceeds anything the Islamic Republic has faced since the darkest days of the Iran-Iraq War in the 1980s. But Tehran has survived convergent crises before, and its capacity for strategic adaptation should not be underestimated. The very sophistication of the shadow oil network that the United States is now successfully targeting took years to build, and it was built precisely because Iranian planners anticipated that exactly this kind of pressure would eventually be brought to bear. There are already reports of Iran exploring new intermediary arrangements, new port relationships, and new financial routing mechanisms designed to preserve some portion of oil export revenue, even in the face of intensified interdiction. Some analysts believe the cat-and-mouse dynamic between American naval and intelligence capabilities and Iranian evasion techniques will continue to evolve, with neither side achieving a permanent decisive advantage. What is clear is that the maritime dimension of the confrontation between Washington and Tehran has entered a new and significantly more intense phase. The United States Navy has demonstrated capabilities and a willingness to use them that Iran had hoped would remain theoretical rather than operational. The $3.2 billion impact is not just a financial statistic. It is a proof of concept, a demonstration that the instruments of American maritime power can be brought to bear against Iran's economic foundations in ways that previous administrations either could not or chose not to execute. Whether that demonstration produces accommodation or escalation remains the central, unresolved question of a geopolitical drama that the entire world is watching with a mixture of fascination and dread. The coming weeks will reveal much about the resilience of Iranian strategic decision-making under genuine economic duress. They will also reveal much about the depth of Washington's commitment to a pressure campaign that carries real risks alongside its potential rewards. For the millions of people whose lives, livelihoods, and security are shaped by what happens in the waters of the Persian Gulf and across the broader Middle East, the stakes could not be higher. The United States Navy just did something devastating to a $3.2 billion Iranian position. What Tehran does next, and what Washington does in response, will determine whether this was the decisive blow that changed everything, or simply the most dramatic move yet in a confrontation that still has many more chapters to write.